Tonight, I am not here to comfort you. Comfort has become a language the world speaks when it wants you to stop asking difficult questions. It wraps uncomfortable truths in soft words until they lose the power to change anyone. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the moment your reflection stopped feeling familiar. The moment you looked into your own eyes and realized the person staring back carried your face, but not your history. No one talks about that moment. No one prepares you for the quiet grief of surviving your own transformation. People think becoming stronger feels victorious. It doesn't. Sometimes it feels like attending the funeral of someone who never had the chance to say goodbye. There was once a version of you that laughed without calculating the consequences. A version that believed promises meant something. A version that trusted without first measuring the risk. A version that didn't scan every room before walking inside. That person didn't disappear overnight. They vanished one disappointment at a time, one betrayal at a time, one silent night at a time. The world likes dramatic stories because they're easier to understand. It wants to believe people change because of one unforgettable event. But real transformation is quieter than that. It happens in conversations you never mention again, in messages that never receive a reply, in apologies that never arrive, in moments where you realize you're the only one carrying the weight of a relationship that already ended in someone else's mind. Nobody notices the first fracture, not even you. It begins so quietly that it feels insignificant. You tell yourself you're just tired, just stressed, just overthinking. But something else is happening beneath the surface, something far more permanent. A part of you is learning that innocence is expensive. A part of you is quietly packing its belongings, leaving rooms inside your heart that it knows it can no longer survive in. You continue living, you continue smiling, you continue answering questions with the same familiar voice. But internally, someone has already moved out. That's the strange thing about becoming someone new. The outside changes last, the inside leaves first. Long before anyone notices your silence, your old self has already walked away. Have you ever caught yourself reacting to something in a way that surprised even you? Someone speaks your name. You answer. Your voice sounds colder than you expected, not angry, not cruel, simply distant, as though emotion now travels through too many locked doors before reaching the surface. You wonder where the warmth went. You wonder what happened to the person who used to speak without armor. The answer isn't complicated. Life taught them that openness attracts people who confuse kindness with weakness, so they adapted. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. People often say, "You're not the same person anymore." They're usually right. What they fail to ask is, who forced the change? Who taught your heart that silence was safer than honesty? Who convinced your mind that expecting less hurts less? Who made you believe that disappearing emotionally was the only way to survive disappointment? Transformation rarely begins with ambition. More often, it begins with exhaustion. The exhaustion of explaining yourself, the exhaustion of forgiving people who never noticed the damage they caused, the exhaustion of hoping tomorrow's version of someone will finally become the persons they promised to be yesterday. Eventually, hope becomes heavy, and when hope becomes heavy, identity begins to change. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop asking questions you already know won't be answered honestly. From the outside, people call you mature. Inside, you're simply tired. The world celebrates resilience. It rarely acknowledges what resilience costs. Every scar teaches a lesson, but every lesson demands payment. Sometimes the payment is trust. Sometimes it's innocence. Sometimes it's the version of yourself you loved the most. No receipt, no refund, just another invisible exchange nobody applauds. Here's the truth few people admit. The strongest people aren't always the bravest. Sometimes they're simply the ones who had no choice but to continue. Strength isn't always courage. Sometimes it's survival wearing courage's clothes, and survival changes people. It teaches you to hear what isn't being said, to notice what others ignore, to recognize the hesitation behind a smile, the emptiness behind laughter, the loneliness inside crowded rooms. You become fluent in invisible things because invisible things once saved your life. That awareness becomes part of you until one day you realize you've become impossible to surprise, not because you've seen everything, because you've learned to expect almost anything. That's when your own reflection starts feeling unfamiliar. Not because your face has changed, because your eyes have. Your eyes now carry conversations nobody heard, battles nobody witnessed, losses nobody applauded, entire chapters you survived without an audience, and perhaps that's the loneliest part. The world keeps talking to the person whose name it remembers, while never noticing the person standing behind those eyes. You answer to the same name, you sign the same signature, you wear the same face, but the soul underneath has crossed a distance no map could ever measure. So tell me, if the person you used to be met, the person you've become today, would they recognize you, or would they quietly wonder, what happened to us? Maybe that's the question we've been avoiding all along. Not, who am I now? But, did I ever get the chance to mourn the person I had to leave behind? Because every transformation carries an invisible funeral, no flowers, no mourners, no final speech, just silence. And a stranger, wearing your name, there is a funeral almost no one attends, no obituary, no flowers placed on a quiet grave, no final embrace, no voices gathering to remember who was lost. Because the person who died is still breathing. They still wake up every morning. They still answer messages. They still go to work. They still smile when someone asks, "How have you been?" But the version of them that once believed life would be kinder never came back. The world has a language for physical loss. It knows how to mourn people who leave. It understands empty chairs, silent bedrooms, forgotten birthdays. But it has no language for grieving yourself. No one tells you what to do when the person you're mourning is the version of you that existed before disappointment rewrote your heart. So you carry that grief alone, quietly, without permission to call it grief. Because how do you explain to someone that you miss the person you used to be? How do you tell them you miss the way your mind once rested instead of constantly scanning for danger? How do you confess that your greatest loss wasn't another person? It was your own innocence. People assume innocence disappears because we grow older. That's not true. Age doesn't steal innocence. Experience does. One betrayal teaches caution. Another teaches distance. Another teaches silence. Until eventually, you stop offering your heart before first asking whether the world deserves it. And that's when the funeral begins. Not with tears, with habits. You stop calling first. You stop expecting replies. You stop believing every promise. You stop telling people what's really on your mind, not because you've become cold, because you've become careful. There's a difference. Coldness rejects everyone. Carefulness simply remembers. It remembers every time openness became a weapon in someone else's hands. It remembers every conversation where honesty was punished. It remembers every moment vulnerability was mistaken for weakness. Mirror is a patient architect. It rebuilds your personality one experience at a time, brick by brick, wall by wall, until one day someone says, "You've changed." And they're right, but they weren't there while the construction was happening. They didn't hear the nights your silence was louder than your voice. They didn't witness the decisions that reshaped your soul. They only met the finished building, never the ruins underneath it. That's why judgment comes so easily. People evaluate the person standing before them. They never ask about the battlefield hidden beneath the surface. If they did, They might understand why your smile now arrives a little later than it used to, why your trust asks more questions, why your heart waits before opening the door. Every scar became an instruction. Every disappointment became another chapter in a manual you never wanted to write. Eventually, you stopped looking for certainty. You started looking for consistency, because beautiful words became less convincing than repeated actions. You learned that affection spoken loudly means very little if loyalty disappears quietly. That realization changes everything, not overnight. Slowly, like winter replacing autumn, almost invisible until one morning you notice every leaf is gone. That's how identity transforms, not through explosions, through seasons. And every season asks something from you. One asks for patience, another asks for hopes. The hardest season asks for surrender. It asks you to release the version of yourself that no longer knows how to survive this reality. That's the version you buried. Not because you stopped loving them, because they couldn't keep living in a world that demanded constant sacrifice. Sometimes survival requires becoming someone your younger self would never understand. That truth carries its own loneliness, because deep inside, a child still lives within you, not a child defined by age, a child defined by wonder. They still remember believing people meant what they said. They still remember trusting without calculation. They still remember giving without expecting betrayal. Sometimes, late at night, you can almost hear them asking, "When did we become so careful?" And you have no answer. Only silence, because there wasn't one single day everything changed. There were hundreds of tiny moments, tiny disappointments, tiny heartbreaks, tiny realizations, each one too small to notice until together they became the person you are now. People celebrate evolution. They rarely acknowledge its cost. Every stronger version of you was purchased by a weaker version that didn't survive. Every lesson demanded an older belief. Every boundary replaced an older dream. Nothing was free, not wisdom, not resilience, not emotional discipline. Everything asked for payment, and the currency was who you used to be. That's why healing isn't about returning to your old self. You can't return to someone whose story has already ended. Healing is learning how to honor that person without trying to become them again, because they carried you as far as they could. Now it's your turn to carry what's left of them. Not with regret, but with gratitude. They believed enough for both of you. They hoped enough for both of you. They loved enough for both of you. Their chapter may be over, but their existence gave birth to yours. So perhaps this isn't really a funeral. Perhaps it's something quieter. A moment of standing beside the invisible grave of the person you once were, whispering the words they never got to hear. You did enough. You survived long enough for me to exist. I won't forget you, because the person you became was built from everything the person you used to be refused to stop believing. And maybe the greatest act of healing is not pretending they never existed, but carrying them forward, not as a wound, not as a weakness, but as the silent foundation beneath every step you take from this moment on. There is a strange loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who only know the edited version of you, the version that smiles on cue, the version that says, "I'm fine," the version that keeps conversations light enough to avoid revealing what lives underneath. Most people believe pain announces itself. They expect tears. They expect broken voices. They expect someone to ask for help. But real pain rarely introduces itself that way. It becomes efficient. It learns how to function. It discovers how to smile while carrying weight no one else can see. The deepest wounds don't always make the loudest noise. Sometimes they become perfectly silent. That's why they survive for so long. No one notices them. Not because people are cruel. Because people often see only what they're prepared to understand. If you've never carried invisible weight, you rarely recognize it in someone else. You mistake exhaustion for laziness, distance for arrogance, silence for indifference, control for coldness. You judge the behavior without ever asking what created it. That's how misunderstood people are born. Not because they're impossible to understand, because no one stays long enough to read beyond the surface. You learned that lesson early. Every time you tried to explain what you felt, someone simplified it. It's just stress. You think too much. You're too sensitive. You need to move on. Interesting, isn't it? The world is quick to diagnose emotions it has never experienced. People hand out advice as if words alone can untangle years of invisible battles. They don't realize some wounds aren't waiting for solutions. They're waiting to be acknowledged. There is a difference. Being fixed is not the same as being understood. Most people rush toward fixing. Very few have the patience to understand. Understanding requires silence. It requires listening without preparing your response. It requires accepting that another person's reality may not resemble your own. That kind of patience has become rare. The world moves too quickly. Attention has become shorter. Conversations have become shallower. Everyone wants to speak. Few are willing to truly hear. So you adapted. You stopped explaining. You stopped translating your inner world into words that made other people comfortable. Instead, you carried it alone. Not because you wanted to, because solitude became easier than being misunderstood. That decision changed you more than you realized. The mind is shaped by repetition. Repeat disappointment often enough, and expectation disappears. Repeat betrayal often enough, and trust begins to feel irresponsible. Repeat loneliness often enough, and silence starts feeling like home. Home. What a complicated word. Some people find it in places. Others find it in people. But there are those who eventually build it inside themselves. Not because they prefer isolation, because it became the only place where they didn't have to explain who they were. Perhaps that's why your inner world became so vast. When no one understands your depth, you begin exploring it alone. You spend years walking through your own thoughts, learning the architecture of your fears. It's naming emotions no one else notices, asking questions the world is too distracted to ask. At first, it becomes awareness, and awareness changes everything. You start noticing the things people accidentally reveal, the hesitation before they answer, the sadness hidden inside their laughter, the exhaustion beneath their confidence, the loneliness behind their achievements. Because once you've learned to hide your own pain, you recognize the art in others. That's the irony. The people carrying the heaviest burdens often become the most compassionate observers. Not because life made them softer, because suffering taught them how to notice. Notice, such a small word, yet it has the power to save someone. Sometimes people don't need answers. They need someone to notice the silence they couldn't explain, to notice the smile that arrived too late, to notice the eyes that looked present, while the soul stood somewhere far away. You waited for someone like that once, someone who would ask a second question after hearing, "I'm okay." Someone who wouldn't accept the rehearsed answer. Someone patient enough to hear the truth hiding behind your pause. Maybe they never came, or maybe they arrived too late. Either way, you learned something unforgettable. You learned how to become your own witness, your own listener, your own place of refuge. That strength looks admirable from a distance. Up close, it's exhausting. Because carrying yourself through every storm means no one sees the effort required simply to keep standing. People applaud visible victories. They rarely recognize invisible endurance. No one celebrates the nights you chose not to give up. No one applauds the mornings you forced yourself to keep moving despite feeling emotionally empty. No audience watches those moments. No medals exist for surviving ordinary days while carrying extraordinary weight. Yet those are often the bravest moments of all. There is another reason people failed to recognize your pain. You became too good at hiding it. Not intentionally, instinctively. You discovered that revealing too much often invited judgment instead of understanding, so your pain became quieter, more disciplined, more private, until even you forgot how heavy it had become. Pain has a strange habit. If carried long enough, stops feeling temporary. It starts feeling like personality. You begin believing, this is just who I am. But pain is not identity. It is experience. And experience, no matter how deep, does not have the final word. Perhaps that's what no one ever told you. You are not the silence you learned to survive in. You are not the disappointments that shaped your caution. You are not the betrayals that taught your heart to hesitate. Those things influenced you. They are not you. Still, they left fingerprints. Invisible ones, the kind only another wounded soul might recognize. Maybe that's why certain people feel strangely familiar. Not because they know your story, because they recognize the language your scars speak without words. Death recognizes depth. Silence recognizes silence. And pain has a way of recognizing itself across crowded rooms. Perhaps that's why you always felt different, not disconnected, just carrying realities most people never noticed. The truth is, your pain was never invisible. It was simply speaking a language very few people had learned to hear. And those who could hear it rarely needed you to explain anything at all. There comes a point in every deeply wounded life where survival changes its strategy. At first, you try to heal, then you try to understand, then you try to forgive. But after enough disappointments, you stop trying to change the world. You change your access to it, quickly, without announcing it, without dramatic speeches or final goodbyes. You simply become harder to reach. People often mistake this for confidence. They see your composure, your restraint, your ability to remain calm while everything around you falls apart. They admire it. They call you emotionally strong, disciplined, unshakable. They don't realize they are looking at armor, not peace, armor. And armor has a price. Every wall that keeps pain outside also keeps something beautiful from getting in. No one tells you that. They celebrate your boundaries. They applaud your independence. They praise the fact that you no longer need anyone. But they never ask the question hiding underneath. What did it cost you to become someone who no longer asks for help? Because no one reaches that point naturally. A person isn't born emotionally distant. Distant is learned. Repeatedly, every disappointment teaches another centimeter. Every betrayal adds another layer. Every broken promise lays another brick, until eventually there is an entire fortress standing where a trusting heart once lived. The strange part is, you don't even notice yourself building it. You call it maturity, you call it wisdom, you call it protecting your peace. Sometimes it is. Sometimes simply fear wearing elegant clothes. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Don't expect too much. Don't become attached. Don't reveal everything. Don't need anyone. At first, those whispers feel intelligent, practical slave. But over time, they become the laws governing your entire emotional world. Without realizing it, you stop protecting your heart. You start imprisoning it. There is a difference. Protection allows doors to open for the right people. A prison forgets doors were ever meant to exist. You became excellent at convincing yourself you were fine alone, and perhaps you truly believed it. Loneliness becomes easier when it is familiar. Silence becomes comforting when chaos has disappointed you enough. You learned to enjoy your own company. You built routines no one could interrupt. You stopped depending on messages that might never arrive. You stopped waiting. Stopped expecting, stopped hoping. The world called it independence. Only you knew how much grief was hiding inside that word, because independence born from freedom feels light. Independence born from disappointment feels heavy. One is a choice. The other is an adaptation. Some nights, you still wonder what it would feel like to lower your guard, not completely, just enough to breathe without constantly measuring every emotional risk. Just enough to speak without editing every sentence. Just enough to believe someone might stay without needing proof every day. Then memory interrupts, it reminds you. It replays old conversations, old betrayals, old exits, old promises that dissolved the moment they became inconvenient. Mirror can be protective, but memory can also become a jailer. It locks today's possibilities inside yesterday's pain. And suddenly, every new person begins paying for someone else's mistakes, not intentionally, instinctively. You tell yourself you're being careful. Perhaps you are. But somewhere along the way, carefulness became permanent. You stopped giving people the opportunity to surprise you. Not because they couldn't, because disappointment felt more predictable than hope. Predictability has a strange comfort. Even when it hurts, especially when it hurts, at least pain you expect doesn't shock you. That's what you convinced yourself. But here's the truth that arrived far too late. The opposite of pain isn't safety, it's connection. And connection demands something armor cannot provide. Exposure. Not reckless exposure, not blind trust, but the courage to remain human in a world that often rewards emotional distance. That kind of courage is rare, not because people lack strength, because they've been punished for using it before. Perhaps that's why the strongest looking people sometimes carry the deepest loneliness. They know exactly how to survive. They've simply forgotten how to be reached. You became fluent in solitude, so fluent that even when someone sincere approached, your first instinct wasn't curiosity, it was evaluation. You examined every word, every gesture, every inconsistency, every silence. You weren't looking for reasons to trust. You were searching for evidence that leaving was inevitable. And when you search long enough, you usually find something. No human being is perfect enough to survive endless suspicion. Eventually, good people grow tired of proving they aren't your past. Not because they lack patience, because they were never fighting against themselves. They were fighting ghosts they could never see, ghosts left behind by people who disappeared long ago. Oh, that's the hidden cost of becoming untouchable. The people who hurt you leave, but the defenses they created remain, sometimes longer than the memories themselves. One day, you wake up and realize you've protected yourself so well that almost nothing reaches you anymore. Not betrayal, but not tenderness either. Not manipulation, but not genuine affection. You stopped bleeding. You also stopped feeling certain kinds of warmth. And perhaps that's the saddest victory of all, winning every battle, while quietly losing the ability to believe peace is possible. Yet somewhere beneath all the armor, beneath every careful decision, beneath every silent retreat, person you used to be still exists, not as weakness, not as naivete, but as a quiet reminder. A reminder that these walls were never built to become your permanent home. They were shelters, not identities, protection, not purpose. Because even the strongest fortress was never meant to keep the sunrise out forever. Maybe the greatest challenge isn't learning how to build walls. You've already mastered that. Maybe the real challenge is recognizing the moment when the war is over and finding the courage to unlock the gates from the inside.